All right. Once again, I am here with Brian Roth, editor of our Sightlines Premium channel, and Kate Bernat, a reporter on Sightlines and Sightlines Premium. We were going to talk about one of the latest themes that we've sort of investigated from a variety of angles recently, which is the value of the branding process, or in many cases, the rebranding process within the beer world. And I think in some cases, we're looking specifically at craft beer, which is a place where I think we are perhaps not used to thinking in terms of the ROI on a rebrand, but more and more we see companies kind of jockeying for increased or renewed relevance of late. Brian, I know you and I were kind of talking about the rebrand for Anchor Steam, which caught a lot of people's attention for better and worse, in many cases worse. Although I personally will defend it. I think it was a pretty great job from a visual branding perspective. But it brought to mind some other recent rebrands we've seen in the last couple of years that I think you and I maybe had some open questions about, and we kind of broadly wanted to go look at the value of rebranding and refreshing, and in some cases repositioning in the craft beer world. And so you kind of went out to tackle kind of the broadside angle of that. And Kate, you went looking for a particular example to dig into in a deeper way, to kind of give us some anecdotal evidence on how people think about some of those things now and the big questions they really ask themselves. Because I think we know when it comes to the world of craft beverage and craft beer, certainly, there's ROI in terms of, what value did it bring monetarily, in terms of sales to the organization. But then there's also other ways in which to measure ROI, of course, which is, what does this set us up for in terms of a brand and a story long term? What else does it enable us to do? What are some other ways in which we could measure value out of something like this, which is a legitimate thing you have to pay for to do. So it's not without its costs. So Brian, in your looking at the world of craft beer and rebranding or refreshing, what were some of the things early on that I guess really kind of stuck out to you as maybe what we're going to be kind of the chapters of that analysis?
Yeah, let's start with the bad stuff. The Anchor, to jump to, I think, an important crux with the Anchor rebrand for those who may not remember or chose to smartly ignore the dust up on social media back at the start of 21, when Anchor announced it was going to rebrand its classic Anchor Steam label. There is the normal kind of reaction where people in the industry, fans, drinkers, professionals, kind of reflected back on, why would they do that? It's such a great label. Well, before, during, and after this release and announcement, it's done nothing. The amount of Anchor Steam being sold today as we talk in June is basically the same amount, seasonally adjusted a little bit, of what was sold at the beginning of the year. And
which is not a great starting place for them.
No, this was a brand in decline already. And as we so often think about with rebrands, sometimes there's a case of something that feels forced. And if you look at the sales data, that was the case here. Now, when we think about, the past 18 months, when there's been lots of time, maybe companies have had an opportunity to sit and reflect on their branding. When we think about what happened with Anchor, they got a basically 1 week of bump. A 1 week that was an outlier. That was the week immediately after the announcement, where they saw their sales in California and nationwide go up. Then it immediately course corrected. So, and
that's not even necessarily an organic sales bump on the consumer's part. A lot of that could be swapping things on the shelves and buybacks through the distributor to make that big initial push a little bit more consistent on the branding side.
Yes. And also, what we saw from those of us within kind of the sphere of beer, seeing that uptick in conversation, I could obviously see something, with the push from wholesalers with this new label, you get that immediate bump. And then it goes back to normal. And this is kind of an extension of something that we had covered last year, going back to the first collection of posts where we looked at timeline for individual brand successes, which, looking at IRI data, which is obviously going to be different than what people see on premise and tap rooms, is that if you don't get something that clicks between 2 and 3 years, there's a good chance that it's just never going to.
Yeah.
And so when we think about that in relation to branding, these kinds of questions come up about a willingness to maybe pivot and move away from things. But that's one example. We'll come back to more. But one of the things that Kate looked into as well was it wasn't just rebranding for the sake of it. Kate, you told a story about rebranding that was going to better fit within the goals of a brewery, and then also be more ideal and respectful to the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. So when I started looking for an example that could maybe add something to this conversation, I think, Brian, you and I had talked about the idea of a rebrand versus just kind of a refresh, and how a small amount of design tweaking and subtle changes can maybe still have quite a large effect on shelf presence, especially. So the brewery that I looked at and spoke with was Pizza Port out of San Diego. And their cans, I think most people would consider them pretty iconic, but the pandemic kind of gave them an opportunity to have some time to kind of dig into longer term projects that they'd been putting off, one of which was like a little brand refresh. And also the pandemic placed such a premium on package sales that it was like, well, we're going to do it now or never. So for them, I think maybe they had seen Anchor as a cautionary tale and were very concerned about too dramatic a departure from the cans that people know and love from them, which have like a very sort of illustrated, hand-drawn kind of feel, and they did not want to get too far away from that. So really what they did was just kind of streamline some of the cans, remove some visual clutter, make the both the Pizza Port name and the individual beer name easier to read on the can without having to kind of rotate it, which I don't think I've ever reached up for a can on a grocery store shelf and like turned it around. I mean, just no one has that time anymore. So that seemed smart. But then also to your point about fitting the culture of the company, the can for their iconic Swami's IPA had a snake charmer with a turban on it. And over the years, Pizza Port had heard from critics that it just kind of offended them, frankly. And they decided, we're already tweaking cans. Let's finally get rid of this. It's not serving us in any way. And so they changed it to a sort of a surfer meditating who keeps the same physical space on the can, but just is no longer offensive. Yeah. And that just feels like a really nice way to like holistically address, in the context of larger changes that you're doing, to also make some changes you've been wanting to do for a while.
Yeah, I mean, in that example, it sounds like you're describing design changes outside of the more sort of emotional community element of that final piece there. It sounds like in general, we're talking about a commercialization process. So this is where I've seen some real value happen. And of course, anybody who knows Good Beer Hunting knows that our design studio side engages in this kind of work all the time. But in our work through the studio side, we find that one of the most advantageous times to invest in a brand refresh or an extension or repositioning is when you're going through a new commercialization process. So when you're opening a new market and you need to consider a brand new audience that doesn't know you locally, doesn't come into your tap room, they're just going to see a can halfway across the country, perhaps, or when you're going into package for the first time. So a lot of breweries who were tap room only or on premise only, or 90% before the pandemic, suddenly had to rush to get their product onto shelves in Whole Foods and things of that sort, had to go through a different type of commercialization process. And so investing time in your brand and the development of your packaging design in those moments, it's probably going to return it. It's going to be critically important to get it right, number one. But it's also a great chance to invest in the larger brand sort of story that you're telling, because people are going to be seeing it for the first time in a big new way. And so talking about the 3 dimensions of the can and designing in the round, designing for the shelf blocking, that's a lot of what I saw in some of the visual refinement of what Anchor's team did, is they were going for a more bombastic shelf presence and an easier visual cue. They certainly shaved off most of the artistic edges of what they've had historically, very clearly in favor of some commercializable kind of elements to the brand that I got to imagine could be very successful if there's a larger context in which that's going to be working. And
it raises the question too, because with the challenge for Anchor with a lot of other brands is that, this was a brand, a long tenured beer that's on decline. There's no reason to think that this branding or anything else is going to save it, increase production volume or sales volumes by any significant amount. And so, Michael, I think it always leads me to wonder, like, when that moment of clarity needs to happen. Because, like I mentioned, we'd looked at this 2 to 3 year span originally. One of the things that came up, both research and conversations with others talking about this, was, every 3 to 5 years, we're thinking about what we need to do. And so it's like there seems to be a distinct time frame not connected to the emotional need of, well, something's happening, we need to do something now.
I mean, the timeframes you're talking about is basically the career lifespan of a brand manager on average. And when you get hired as a brand manager, one of the things you want to do is make an impact, because that's what, and not purely cynically, but you are going to need to have shown that you made an impact if you're going to move up in that company or go to a different company and take over a new brand. You don't come in as a brand manager just to keep things the same. That's just sort of like that would be sacrilege. You'd be undermining your own career goals if you did that in many cases. And so that 3 to 5 years is really about the tolerance people have for not changing things when a brand is seen as vulnerable. If a brand is performing like gangbusters and it's growing and nobody's questioning that, then certainly it can last longer and it can attain this sort of classicness through not changing. You'll see it in larger, in multinational portfolios. They will have brands that they consider in protect status, which is you're basically not allowed to change anything for a while until you get approval from the top. I remember doing some innovation projects for brands in the Miller portfolio years ago, and Miller Lite was just one we basically weren't allowed to change anything about. But if we had a good idea, we could throw it at Mickey's any time of the day, and nobody would care because it wasn't going to cost anybody their job. So a lot of that is rooted in cultural things, within the company itself and what its tolerance for a brand is and the kind of vulnerable status that's in. So a brand like Acre Steam ended up, in my opinion, it was probably ripe or I should say unable to defend itself against any of those challenges because it was so vulnerable in the sales numbers. Somebody had to pull a trigger somewhere. And so that visual brand, became a very, very vulnerable piece of that had to change. Now, I think in the article, one of the things that I ended up talking to you about, Brian, was that regardless of how successful that visual language might be, which we may never know, it really doesn't seem to have been contextualized beyond the visual packaging refresh, which is really that's the disheartening part of that for me is, there hasn't been a lot of clarity around the communication of the portfolio going forward, and there's nothing to really be excited about there. We haven't seen a lot of new POS coming out that, that gives it a new position in grocery store chains or big box retail. I've seen some updates to their Instagram, some better photos because the product speaks better and it's in a different context. They're showing it with food and at tables and, retail, smaller residential gatherings, but I'm not seeing that as full page ads and Bon Appetit or anything, which is where it needs to be for that to really, really start to resonate. So, yeah, all of that comes down to budgetary concerns, of course. But if you really want to make a once in a generation brand refresh on something like Anchor Steam, like you kind of have to have the war chest ready to go to give it some oomph to make that worth it. Otherwise, it's a big, expensive refresh that results in continuing decline and flat numbers.
There's something here too, because a company like Anchor is going to be very different than 99% of other beverage alcohol producers in the U.S., where I think the common refrain that we at least see in public conversations from people who talk about these decisions is partially, representing their internal ethos, what customers want from them, and then the liquid speaks for itself. I'm going to put quotations around that because for people in the industry and for those of us who cover it and talk to people, like that's only going to take you so far. We focus on quality, does not function on a can or a bottle. And
those are table stakes.
The experiential part of it is separate. And Kate, I know, we can't maybe place the success of Swanee and others on this refresh, but there was at least some specific results that they saw, that Pizza Port saw from doing some of this in the aftermath of updating the thing.
Yeah, so the this brand sort of refresh extended to all of the breweries' core beers, and their full portfolio grew dollar sales about 48% in IRI tracked stores for the 12-week period that ended May 2nd of this year versus that 12-week the year prior. So, but again, when I talk to the brewery, they are equally as, you know, they're certainly glad to see those IRI sales increase, obviously, but they're also, how much of that is the rebrand? How much of that is perhaps additional placements they secured because of that? I mean, you can't isolate that brand refresh variable completely on its own, devoid of other context entirely. So, but in their case, at least it wasn't stagnant or declining. So there's that. And I think when we think about that in contrast to Anchor, I guess the question I would ask about that is, how much of the Anchor refresh just didn't have the why behind it, and could consumers read that into it? That they didn't, you know, they refreshed. Why? Well, because the old one was sold.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Michael, you mentioned to me this idea of world building, and I think you were kind of talking about, you know, you enter a new market, there's other things that you can do or should be doing. When you talk about changes like this in terms of the idea of it being part of a world building project, what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the context of Anchor, even if you go to their new Instagram, I'm starting to see them share photos of people enjoying the product. There's like the hint of some lifestyle on the edges. But if I were really trying to build a world around that, to Kate's point, like to build a why into that, I think I would be trying to show the lifestyle that we associate, you know, we as Anchor, if I can step into their shoes for a moment, associate with the emotional sort of onus of this rebrand. Like, what do we want it to feel like? How do we want it to show up in the world differently than it used to, which is in a cooler on the back bar down low somewhere, right? Like where like the type is really small, and you might know it well by the little scrolly thing on there if you're familiar with the shape of, you know, the iconic shape of the bottle and things like that. Now it's on a 12-ounce can and a 12-pack, and it's bright yellow with a big anchor. Like, what does that mean for you? I would want to start building a world around that creates context for people, that gets them excited about what that indicates about the brewery now and into the future. Does it mean that they're going to be making different styles? Does it mean that it's going to be showing up in different places? Like maybe it becomes the beer of choice for large venues in California, and that's okay. Show me the damn ball game all the time. Like make me associate that beer with a moment or an occasion or a lifestyle that I would, potentially find very exciting or emotionally kind of connected to in some way. You can't just keep showing me pictures of the cans. It has to show up in a world where it matters. And convincing me that it matters in my world starts by convincing me that it matters in somebody else's world. And I can start to draw a connection or a relatability between my world and theirs. And so, I think that it's easy for people to forget how much world building you have to do when you're distributing in your home markets. And if you're kind of in your home bubble, it's easy to take that for granted because you have built a literal physical world in your tap room, in your brewery. And if you go to Anchor Steam, you see the copper kettles, you see the open fermentation, you see the weird hop aging rooms where just in piles of buckets and bags. And like, there's a world there to really take. That's like Willy Wonka-esque there. And if that's where you're spending your time and you're launching a brand in your mind from there, it's really easy to take for granted how much of a world you've already built and how much context already exists for you. But you fly across the country to North Carolina and you don't have any of those things at your disposal anymore. What is the world that you're asking people to imagine this package in now? And so often people forget that stuff just doesn't travel. And so building a world outside of that, I remember when we were talking with Ska Brewing, when they were launching into Minnesota, like they designed a beer specifically for that market that was the color purple, and it had a story around it and a name that appealed to people, and it had a fruit in there that appealed to people from Minnesota. And so they, that's maybe a very small anecdotal example, but they were trying to build some context around their brand in a faraway market that resonated locally. And they put a lot of effort into that, and they saw some success with that in the numbers. Now, can you do that with every single beer and every single launch? No, you can't do that, sustainably. But for the purposes of a rebrand or a refresh, like you better be able to do that at least then, if never again. And that seems like a real missed opportunity for me, because it seems like the biggest conversation that was had about that around that rebrand was negatively on Twitter, and then the union sort of like basically apologizing for it. And it was kind of a bummer to see that happen, because they should have had everybody in line internally at that brewery with a story that they believed in, that they could go out into the world and share. And it just didn't seem like they even had those first steps internally kind of accounted for.
There is a very distinct communications strategy aspect to what you're talking about, which I think can easily, this is not just unique to beer, but I think can easily fall to the wayside when so much time and attention is paid to just getting the thing done. One area of that world building that, Kate, I know you and I have talked about, is the way that this kind of thing plays in e-commerce. And this is not just specific to kind of the big brands that we're talking about, but, you know, in that world building, the way that it can shift from an individual market to the ecosystem of the World Wide Web. You know, and if your ask is for someone to make a decision without ever able to hold, see, talk, hear someone else talk about your product, making things simple on a app or platform or wherever it may be is really, really important. And so I think this is one of those forward-looking things when you talk about the potential for refreshing or rebranding as online sales continue to matter more and more, is simplifying that process for people, whether that's naming, you know, removing, it doesn't need to be just geometric shapes. You need to give them a reason to understand it when they're looking at it on an app, which is the majority of these sales, or on a computer. Kate, what have you seen from the conversations reporting that you've done around this kind of e-commerce space as it relates to this?
Yeah, well, whenever I think about beer e-commerce, I like to think about other types of e-commerce, because I think beer gets in its own head about how you sell beer online. It's like, how do people sell other goods online? Let's take fashion and world building in fashion. When I'm shopping online, I don't just see a shirt hanging on a hanger on a white wall. It's like beautiful people wearing it, looking wonderful with other accessories, with their friends, having fun in a place. Like, it's showing me how I can wear that and experience it. Beer generally struggles to do that, I think, through e-commerce, but a very small but like very useful, I think, and positive example that I've seen is the way that Three's Brewing organizes their online shop. You can filter by size and style, the kind of traditional stuff, but then they have little logos that say beach beer or fresh drop and you know, or collab. And those are small little buttons, but they're helping me immediately see, this is the beer for the beach. You're telling me what I'm going to do with this. And when we're distracted and I have 27 tabs open, that is helpful in reminding me why I came to that store and what I'm going to do with that beer once it's in my cart. So I think beer is becoming savvier to trying to build that world even through a computer screen.
I think it's a great point. I mean, especially the tell me what it's for moment, because that doesn't have to be a limiting thing. Like, people get, I think marketers sometimes they forget that one of the ways in which you can appeal to everybody at all the time is through very specific moments of recognition. So, you know, that's not necessarily limiting. Our studio had a lot of success recently with the New Belgium Domingo launch, which is, you know, we called it a mimosa sour, and we're basically marketing it as the beer for brunch. And some of the first things we heard online from a couple industry insiders, you know, they liked the way it looked, but they're like, why would you just want to have a beer for brunch? Like, that's so limiting. And I'm like, are you kidding me? If I can get people to remember that this is the beer for brunch, I'm going to get them to remember this thing 6 other times that week for other reasons. Like, it's not going to be boxed into that. And we've seen great success with it because we're showing people exactly when we imagined it, you know, where we find it to be most relevant. We've built a visual and an occasion-based world around it. So every time you see a photo of it, it looks like a brunch table. Like it, and it just, the goal is to just get you to have a visceral reaction to it. Because if you like brunch, you will like this beer. If you like those flavors, you will like this beer. If you like those moments and those feelings, you will like this beer. But starting with that one hyper simple, very focused occasion gives us a permission to kind of travel with the drinker into other occasions as well. Otherwise, we're just trying to convince you to drink sour beer. And that's just a long road full of many dead soldiers who have tried their hardest. And that's not a battle I'm looking to fight.
I want plugging something that came up in reporting on this too was a conversation about the rebrand that took place with Springdale, which is the sister company of Jack's Abbey. One of the things that they did was using specific flavor experience cues on their packaging, where they will list, say, 3 things related. So if it's a stout, they might say, chocolate, roasty, etc. And, this is we've written in the past about older drinkers. I had a conversation with my mom just recently, who is in her mid-60s, who thought it was so wild that she just bought a bag of coffee because she knows I like coffee. So she bought a bag of coffee that had descriptors on it. So when she gave it to me and we could have a cup together, she said, "Oh, I saw it's going to taste like these things on this bag. So now I know that you and I can enjoy it because I know what I'm experiencing." And it is about removing those barriers. And this is one of those things that I feel like in many different ways we have talked about and written about over the course of the last year, is that the speed of decision making, let alone the speed of life, even as we have to slow down in our little inner bubbles, those decisions need as much help. Like, you hold their hand as far as you can take them, because exactly to what you're talking about, Michael, that we so often think it has to be universal to be successful, but the narrower we can get with our own personal stories, that's how we often relate best to other human beings. So even when we get narrow, we can get wider in how it applies to people.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of sour beer, I mean, I might not know if I like sour beer, but I know that I like things that taste like oranges. And so it's just a way in, it's just a respectful way in. Yeah. I mean, some of that is certainly hand-holding. Some of that is just respecting people and letting them know what's coming.
It's considering the person. I'm, again, going back to the Threes web shop. It's respecting, those little icons are respecting the people who see double dry hopped Azacca double IPA and have no context for what that's about. Like I don't know what 2 out of those 3 words are. And I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that beer. Is it special? Is it for drinking all the time? Can I bring it to a party? Like, it's hard to step outside your own bubble and realize that some people don't know what those words are. But, reaching out to those people through the e-commerce experience to say, this is what this beer will do for you, and when it's a good time to drink that, I think is such a nice way of inviting new people to the table without, of course, alienating the people who do know what the double dry hopped Azacca double IPA is.
Yeah.
No one is worse off because you put the beach beer sticker on it.
Right. I think your reference to how other things are sold online is a phenomenal point to make, because beer does get in its own head a lot. Fashion, what I've seen in fashion lately, because it's just been all Instagram for the last year, basically, is how people are buying clothes. They're doing everything they can to make it feel as if you've already worn this garment. Like it's not just scrolling through different shots of detail on the fabric anymore. You're scrolling through images and it suddenly becomes a video and it's showing you somebody moving in it. So you get a sense of the weight of the fabric and the texture of it. And I just see so much more effort being put into the visceral experience of the thing. And beer tends to just be, sticking around as product shots. Like, how close can you get a person to feeling like they've already drank this thing and love it? Like, how can you give them create that sensation in the corners of their mouths when they crave something? When our mouths start to water, like, how close can you get me to feeling that feeling? If you're trying to sell me that thing, I just think there's a long way to go for some of those elements for beer.
Michael, maybe I'm going to go narrow with hope you can take us wide. When you have these kinds of conversations with smaller producers, what is the first question you ask of them to answer?
I mean, when I'm working with smaller producers in the first few years, even in the first few years, you usually have to resist that urge to change things. And what I try to remind them of is that in your first few years, you will feel like you have already said everything you need to say as a brand, as a storyteller. And you will feel like everybody's already heard everything. But what you don't realize is you've reached 1% of your potential audience if you're lucky. Like, that would be a huge win. Like, there are people in your town that still don't know you exist yet, let alone are interested in the nuances of a brand refresh, as if that's going to somehow convince them. And so I think some of the things we end up talking about is we try to keep each other honest about how far we think our reach is. And if we think that things have gotten static or they've gotten a little flat for some reason in the market, do we think that's because of the visual brand? Do we think it's because of the story we're telling? Or do we think that we need new channels? Or do we need to get more active in that marketplace in different ways? Or have we not made it simple enough for people to become our word of mouth marketing? You know, if you have a complex story and a complex product, your word of mouth marketing is going to be abysmal because people can't confidently talk about it. So the things that we ask ourselves are mostly like keeping honest questions and trying to not change things for the sake of, kind of A/B testing something or just throwing something at the wall to see if, we can get some energy out of it. In more cases than not, we are sticking to our guns. We are sticking with the story and just finding more ways to tell that same story and more ways to get the visuals out there. East Brother is a great example of somebody who I think has really internalized this as one of our clients. We, from day one, we knew that the founders of that brewery were probably not going to be, they were in their 50s and early 60s. They are not the cool hype kids running out there to like joining every cool beer thing and trying to be the face of a company. In many cases, they actually tried to not represent the company. And we knew from day one that their cans were going to be the most important visual brand element of it for years. And so every chance we get, we show the cans. We don't even show the logo, we show the cans. And when we make stickers, it's a sticker of the can. And like those, so we've kept those cans remarkably simple so that they work at a large scale and a miniature scale. So when they show up and they can be as small as the icon and on tap, so you get used to seeing that can. And so we've kind of had to stick to that for a long time, and it's been highly, highly effective. The cans are the thing that people associate with East Brother now. They don't have there's not a complex story behind it. They don't associate it with individuals. They don't associate it with even that much of a lifestyle. They associate it with the industrial manufacturing footprint of that 16-ounce can in a solid color with a script logo. And that's done wonders in terms of building awareness because they're still telling that same story. They're still telling that 16-ounce can story. And that might sound remarkably simple to anybody that's out there with a new release every week trying to get attention. But it's a different game. It's a low and slow and incremental game. And it's been going very, very well for them. And now they're attracting attention from places like Japan and China and Mexico because those cans have become their message. And they show up in places and people want to get a hold of them, and then they find them very quickly and easily.
Michael, can you contrast that with what you said about Anchor? Just because to me, it sounded like there's a time frame there. You're talking about younger producers. With Anchor, you were talking about the value of maybe just hammering home the environment and experience. If it's a ball game, show it all the time at the ball game. Versus East Brother, where you're saying the can is it. This is what we need to focus on. What's the difference there? Is it just the age?
I think it's the focus and it's the confidence in the particular story choices you're going to make. So I'll contrast what Anchor's team is doing with maybe what Goose Island is doing in Chicago. I don't know the internal strategy at Goose Island, but watching it from afar, it seems very, very clear that they are going to milk the Chicago White Sox relationship for all it's fucking worth. And what I see there, I don't get bored of the story. I see them developing more interesting and funny content ways around the White Sox. When something happens at a White Sox game, they talk about it on their social media. They make sure their product is always pumped through those games and associated with it. They've got ball players talking about it. Like, they have decided that the Chicago White Sox is going to be their primary storytelling avenue for however long. And I don't see them wavering from that. And that it's that confidence that you've chosen the right channel and the right story that is really impactful for me there, because over time you're building equity in that relationship so that when people think of the White Sox, they also think of Goose Island Brewing Company. Now, lots of smaller breweries have gotten relationships with venues, but they don't necessarily, I guess, have the confidence that enough people are going to care about that long term. Or we shared like 4 Instagram posts last month about the stadium in Atlanta. Maybe we're overdoing it. It's like, no, overdoing it is how you ensure that enough people hear it enough times for them to remember it 2 months from now. And then you're going to still have to be hitting over the head. So what I see there is a commitment to a story and a channel for, that's a campaign commitment. And that's how you're going to build equity in the value of what you're doing.
There's something here, Kate, that I want to maybe kick to you too, because what you're talking about, Michael, there was like this silly scientific method to look at the human, the length of attention that we have now as humans. where it's like if you watch a music video, there's no shot that lasts longer than 3 seconds. Or like the memory for a goldfish is like 8 seconds, but we can't hold on longer than that. So that's literal and metaphorical, because so often we think something's gone wrong, so we're quick to forget what got us there, and we just look at, like, let's point at this thing, that's the problem, so we need to find a new solution. I don't know if there's an attention and attention to detail are merging here in that way, but it does feel like something that should be considered in terms of where we look to problems and how we think about solutions.
Yeah, I think it feels to me that sometimes a visual identity brand logo gets pointed at as a fix to whatever is going wrong with us, which is usually like slow sales or lack of interest. It feels like a thing that is easily used as a Band-Aid or as a quick, kind of knee jerk, like, well, we'll just like redesign it and it'll look cool and people will be interested. And I'm curious, Michael, why you think people think that way, and then what actual narrow problems can a redesign solve, or what goals can it help a brewery actually meet?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the risk of getting a little woo-woo on this, it's like, I mean, when you wake up feeling insecure and like you're full of shit someday, like how often do you just like put on a cool hat and think that fixed it enough, right? So like, I think we extend that strategy to lots of things. If we don't know the answer and we have a feeling that the question is really within somewhere and we're insecure about something fundamental, I mean, a quick aesthetic fix on the outside that is like, facing away from us, just, man, I'm so much happier pulling that lever than having to like investigate like what all the answers to the questions I don't even know to ask properly. And so maybe something like that sticks in it, and it serves as an escape hatch out of this problem I don't know how to solve or don't even know how to think about solving. So I think in the fast-paced world, especially of craft beer, where everything is new all the time, having to sit down and think about a problem deeply and longly and thinking about the future of it is a really hard thing to do, because as a small business operator of any sort, you're just being pulled in a million directions and you're trying to solve problems that can be solved right now with the means that you have. And so I think that's just a problem with the human condition more than anything. I think that shows up in our studio team environment all the time. I mean, we've basically, over the years, kind of slowly backed away from like refresh opportunities that don't seem rooted in something bigger and deeper and more ambitious. Anybody who just wants to freshen things up or have a new face, like, doesn't really return the value, even for us, for having worked on it, because it just so quickly goes into the hopper of not really mattering. And the things that we've been looking for real value opportunities over time as a studio is we want to put our time into something that feels like it actually has a real strategy and an end goal that it's pursuing. And so those tend to be bigger projects. They tend to be a little bit slower, or they tend to be really small projects like an East Brother, but we know we're going to be working on that same story and that same intent over the course of years, and kind of chipping away at that mountain. Those are really rewarding as well, especially, years into a project and you hear people discovering a brand like East Brother for the first time and just talking about how beautiful and interesting it is, and they love the beers and it all, and they can speak back to you what brand strategy is years later. That's really, really rewarding. And so, we kind of look for those bookend opportunities. All the stuff in the middle is people trying to figure out how to solve a problem fast, cheap, don't really know what the answer is. They're probably going to try it again in a couple of years when they get a new brand manager, all those kinds of things. That's a lot of what you call being a busy idiot. You don't really know what you're doing, but you're working really hard on it. That's a lot of lost time and value potentially. Which, in our story, I see examples of things that I think could have been big and could have been really, really valuable and ultimately weren't, because they didn't have that kind of consideration behind them. Like Atlanta Brewing. I thought that was what an amazing opportunity. They changed their name from, I can't remember what it was, to Atlanta Brewing Company. And you're going to put the word Atlanta on there now. And it seems like you actually don't know what Atlanta you're talking about. Like it just seems really generic instead of specific and big and rich and layered and cool. Like, you get to represent the city of Atlanta. I don't know if there's a hotter city in America right now other than maybe Austin, Texas, once again. But yeah, imagine being Austin Beer Works down there and not knowing who you are, what you want to do. I mean, those guys are so good at representing the city of Austin. Atlanta had an opportunity like that. It feels like they, at least this round, maybe squandered it by just focusing on the visual refresh.
Yeah, and that brand too was Atlanta Brewing, then Red Brick Brewing.
That's what it was, yep.
And then decided to become Atlanta again. And I think that speaks to some of the long game vision that you're talking about, and what that can matter. They got the little bump, as you do when you release something new, but then things kind of went right back to normal.
Yeah.
That also feels like an example of the trying to be everything to everyone instead of having a really clear idea of who you're talking to and what you're talking about. It's just like, we're from Atlanta, whatever that might mean.
Right.
Welcome to Atlanta, a friendly city. Like, when you have a city with so much dynamic culture and history and incredible food, and you better sports, you better know music. I can't even stop thinking of all the cool things about Atlanta. Like, you better have a slice of that to talk about.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Well, thanks for the therapy.
So you're saying a cool hat won't solve my problems?
You'll be fine for the day. Nobody will know. Okay. Nobody will know. How would they know? No, it's yeah. Anybody, if you want to get by, you can get by. That's what that lesson is. But I think the last thing you quoted me on in that article, Brian, was look, if you don't know what your refresh is about and you don't know what it means and you don't know what you want from it, just make the words IPA bigger on the label and you'll get better results. It's fine. It's fine.
Today's action item.
Well, I appreciate you guys talking about this. I know between the studio side of Good Beer Hunting, which has become Feel Goods, and what we do on the editorial side with some of this analysis, it doesn't always dovetail this neatly. I'm often learning things from you as you're learning from me, but this one, it felt like a real sort of aligned kind of interest in what that space means. But honestly, I've never looked at it from the angle that you guys looked at it from. And so it was still very educational even for me, even though I have a vested interest in the outcome of what it means to brand a brewery at this point. It was still a really fresh perspective for me. So I really appreciate that and the effort that took.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this week's content is all about the convenience store that just went out, the last two pieces. As me and Brian and Kate continue to revisit the relevance of convenience stores, if we could bang that drum any harder, I think people would probably start getting annoyed with us. But that continues to be a major source of opportunity for smaller brewers, smaller beverage companies that are looking at single serve convenience customers. It's a premium market. There's a lot of motion happening there, especially as the world of retail has shifted so much in the last year. I hope people are keeping up with that. I hope they're looking for the opportunities that apply to their business. And just like everything we do, we're always looking to help people be smarter, more informed decision makers for whatever it is they're trying to achieve with their small business. So goodbeerhunting.com/sightlines. That's where you'll find us. That's where you'll find the content. That's where you'll find the sign up for the premium subscription to the content and community that we have that helps us mine some of these insights and provide those anecdotal examples that are so valuable. Thanks once again for your time and insight.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Kate.